Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And sorry to be late. Very busy day. But I know it is for you guys, too. So good afternoon. This week in Washington, I've been meeting with Canada's partners and allies at the annual meetings of the IMF World Bank, as well as the G7 and G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meetings. Underlying all of the conversations we had this week was the recognition that people around the world, very much including in Canada, are contending with the impact of inflation, of the cost of living, and with the economic aftershocks of COVID. It was an opportunity for me to talk about our targeted and compassionate approach to supporting Canadians, including our doubling of the GST tax credit, which we hope will be delivered to Canadians in the coming weeks. Des semaines comme celle-ci sont importantes pour nous tous. En tant que ministre des Finances, nous devons nous réunir pour discuter des questions économiques fondamentales qui touchent les gens dans nos pays. Nous sommes tous très conscients que nous devons trouver un juste équilibre. Un équilibre entre le soutien à celles et ceux qui en ont le plus besoin en cette période difficile et ne pas empirer l'inflation mondiale à laquelle nous sommes tous confrontés. We're also very aware of the importance of looking ahead, of making sure we work together, countries around the world, to tackle our shared problems, to tackle the shared problems of the global commons. First and foremost, the existential question of climate change, and also other really important issues like global food security. It was very clear to many of us gathered this week that there is one immediate step that would eliminate significant turmoil in the global economy, help alleviate food shortages, and help with the high cost of energy in so much of the world. And that step is for Russia to leave Ukraine now. And that was very much on the agenda. As I said in the meeting, speaking directly to the Washington-based Russian representatives who were there, the IMF World Bank meetings are a meeting of the firefighters, of the ministers and central bank governors whose job it is to protect the global economy. Russia right now is the arsonist, and Russia should not have been at the G20 meeting. The arsonist has no place in a meeting of the firefighters. Canada will continue to hold Russia to account, and we will continue to call out its absolutely reprehensible war crimes in Ukraine. Dans le discours que j'ai prononcé mardi, j'ai mentionné la transition actuelle de la dépendance à l'égard des despotes vers une dispense à l'égard des démocraties. Cette transition représente une occasion économique pour le Canada et les travailleurs canadiens qui n'arrivent qu'une fois par génération. J'en parlerai davantage la semaine prochaine. Mais les réunions de cette semaine m'ont donné l'occasion de réaffirmer à nos plus proches alliés que le Canada sera là pour les aider à faire cette transition. This week, the Government of Canada and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development signed an agreement under which Canada will guarantee the repayment of more than 36 million euros to support Naftogaz, Ukraine's state-owned gas company, so that Naftogaz can continue to deliver energy to the people of Ukraine. This support is part of a $300 million euro agreement between the EBRD and Naftogaz, and will help ensure that Ukrainians are able to keep the lights on and heat their homes during the winter months. This issue of energy supplies for Ukraine this winter is something that Canada and I have discussed at length with the Ukrainian Prime Minister, with the Ukrainian Finance Minister. It's an effort that we hope and believe many of our other allies will join in on, and I know it's a priority, quite rightly and understandably, for the government and people of Ukraine, and I'm glad that we're able to do our part. Finally, and with the very clear recognition that some of the most vulnerable countries in the world are the most susceptible to turbulent economic times, like the one we are living through, are the most susceptible to climate change, are the most susceptible to global pandemics. I'm also really happy to announce that Canada has completed its $2.4 billion SDR-denominated contribution to the IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Fund. This is a really innovative fund. I do want to recognize the work of the IMF, really the personal leadership of Kristalina Georgieva in putting this fund in place. The Resilience and Sustainability Fund is there to help low-income countries around the world build resilience to external shocks, and Canada is one of the first countries to finalize our contribution to this really important fund that meets the needs of the moment. And I spoke to some countries, finance ministers of some countries, about the fund, and they talked to me about how this is financing that they need, available on the most favorable terms. So I got a direct sense of the value of this, and I'm really glad that we're able to be part of it. I also had great bilateral meetings with many ministers. Pascal Donoghue, the Finance Minister of Ireland, Grant Robertson, New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Nigel Clark, Jamaica's Minister of Finance, Annika Saarikko, Finland's Minister of Finance, Paolo Gentiloni, the EU Commissioner for the Economy, Serhiy Marchenko, the Ukrainian Finance Minister, and we held some events also with Christine Lagarde, the Governor of the ECB, and with Jim Chalmers, the Australian Treasurer. Later today, together with my German counterpart, Christian Lindner, where we will meet business and labor leaders to continue some of the important conversations that our leaders, Prime Minister Trudeau, Chancellor Schultz, had in Canada over the summer about how Canada and Germany can continue to work even more closely together. And really foremost in our minds is going to be how we can ensure that this collaboration helps Canadian people, helps Canadian workers. Thank you very much. Happy to take your questions.
Bonjour, merci d'être venu. On va faire une question et une suivi pour commencer. If you don't mind just coming up to the microphone for the benefit of those watching online and on TV, so they can hear your questions. And if you don't mind just stating your name and network,
Yeah, no worries. Hi, Deputy Prime Minister. Adrian Moore with the Globe and Mail. You said that Russia has no place in the G20 and maybe even no place in the IMF. What can or should Canada do to basically suspend them or kick them out of the G20?
I think that we need to continue to do what we have been doing. Canada is a very clear and very strong advocate for, I was going to say for Ukraine, but actually Canada is a very clear and strong advocate in these meetings for the significance of a clear, unequivocal response to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's something that I underscored in all of my remarks, that the Prime Minister is very strong on, that Minister Joly is very strong on. We're working very closely on that in a really coordinated way with our G7 partners, but also with a group of countries far beyond that. And I am glad that Canada has been able to take a leadership role in this effort. We were very clear, both publicly and in closed-door meetings, that we believe Russia has no place today while it is illegally invading Ukraine, killing Ukrainians, torturing Ukrainians, it has no place at the G20 table. And we're just going to keep on saying that.
So is there a move afoot within the G20 to suspend Russia?
I think I answered the question, Adrian. You know, we believe very strongly that it's just inappropriate. The job of the G20 is to guarantee the global commons. And one of the biggest threats, not only to the lives of Ukrainians right now, not only to the sanctity of the international rules-based order, but also to the world economy today, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Hi, Alex Panetta, CBC News.
Hi, Alex.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about your Brookings speech earlier this week. There were some big themes in it, but I wanted to touch on a very specific line regarding energy. You indicated that Canada might want to show its allies the same consideration Europe did on vaccines, and Canada could do it in the case of either fossil fuel projects or electric vehicle projects. What I wanted to ask you is if you had any specific projects in mind, any specific regulations, any changes that you actually envisioned when you wrote that line.
Let me add to that renewable energy projects, like the great project in Newfoundland, which Prime Minister Trudeau and Chancellor Schultz together supported over the summer. And I made specific reference to that project in my speech. Let me just sort of step back and say two things. One is, I really believe that we need to collectively understand that the green transition is a monumental thing, a monumental endeavor that we're just getting started on. Chancellor Schultz said to me when he was still finance minister, and he repeated this when he was visiting us over the summer, that in his view, and I think he's absolutely right, this transition is comparable in scale only to the Industrial Revolution itself. And it's easy to say that, but I think we all need to take a deep breath and think about the numbers and the scale involved. And what I think that means is we all need to kind of kick it up a gear. We need to understand, if we're going to do this, and we have to do this, we have to respond to climate change, we need to act even more energetically and aggressively than we have hitherto. And Canada has been a leader in this. In the IMF report on Canada that came out this week, Canada got some big check marks for our strong climate action policies. My point is, we have to do even more. We have to act with the urgency that the climate demands. And I think that means we need government policies in place. We need government investment in place. We need to find ways to attract even more private capital. And that is something that our government is absolutely committed to doing.
Can I ask you maybe just to repeat a bit of that in French, but also as a follow-up, can you give me an example of some urgent actions you'd like to see your government or other governments take?
Oui, je vais essayer. Alors, je veux commencer en soulignant à quel niveau la transition verte est un grand défi. Un grand défi et une grande opportunité pour le Canada, évidemment. Nous avons besoin de changer les principes fondamentaux de notre économie. Et comme l'a dit le chancelier Schultz, comme il l'a dit à moi quand il était le ministre des Finances, c'est un changement qui a le seul parallèle à ce changement, c'est la révolution industrielle elle-même. Alors, c'est vraiment une grande chose. On aura besoin de beaucoup des investissements publics et privés, et on aura besoin au Canada et autour du monde d'une mentalité que nous devons faire des grandes choses. Je sais que le Canada est déjà une leader en ce plan, et ce n'est pas seulement mon opinion, c'est ce que le Fonds monétaire international a dit cette semaine. L'FMI a souligné le leadership du Canada avec notre prix sur la pollution. Mais nous devons faire beaucoup de plus et notre gouvernement est absolument prêt à le faire. Concernant les projets particuliers, le projet que le Premier ministre et le chancelier ont annoncé ensemble en Terre-Neuve, c'est un très important projet de l'hydrogène. Et ce n'était pas une coïncidence que mardi, quand j'ai fait mon discours, que le Premier ministre et mon homologue François-Philippe Champagne étaient en train d'annoncer au Québec un grand investissement du Rio Tinto et du gouvernement canadien dans les minéraux critiques. Alors, c'est un processus qui est déjà en train. Mais nous devons faire de plus et nous devons aussi souligner pour nos partenaires internationaux que le Canada est en train de faire des grandes choses, des grands investissements, des grands projets et on veut attirer du plus parce que c'est important pour notre action sur le climat et en bout de ligne, c'est un défi, oui, concernant le climat, mais c'est une grande opportunité pour les travailleurs canadiens et canadiennes.
Hi, Deputy Prime Minister James McCartan, Canadian Press. Just to pick up on Alex's question about your speech on Tuesday, you mentioned specifically the need for democracies to spend more domestic political capital in the name of your economic vision. I'm wondering to what extent you were aiming that message at your own government, and to what extent you feel that your own government could spend more domestic political capital in the name of energy, for instance, for Europe.
What I sought to do in that speech is connect the dots, first and foremost, for an international audience about what Canada is doing already. To connect the dots that actually start in 2015 with our price on pollution. Those dots run through the new NAFTA. That is actually a really important basis for a lot of the investment we're seeing, particularly in the car sector right now. Dots that actually run through to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, where what could have been something very damaging for the Canadian economy actually turned out to be a set of measures that contained incentives for investing in the Canadian economy. And then to connect the dots through to the budget in the spring, which included an unprecedented investment in critical minerals and metals. And both the 21 budget and the 22 budget included real investments in the net zero accelerator in the CIF. And you are seeing the Prime Minister and François-Philippe Champagne put that money to work in Canada. So, you know, what I wanted to do first and foremost is say to the world, look, Canada gets it. This is what we are doing. And if people who heard my speech thought, wow, the Canadians really are doing some great stuff here, I'm going to go visit Canada and invest some money and create some great jobs in Canada, that would be a really good thing. As I said in response to Alex's question, you know, I think we collectively need to recognize the scale of the green transition. And I don't want in any way to suggest Canada is behind. If anything, I think Canada is really in the lead on so many issues here. But we have to do even more. Climate change is real, and climate action is a huge economic and industrial project. It's going to require significant investment, public, private, Canadian, international, and it's going to require us to build a lot of stuff. And I am not, in any way naive about the scale of that challenge. This is really hard things that we're talking about. But I am also really optimistic about the magnitude of the economic opportunity that affords Canadian workers.
Does that all then mean that LNG shouldn't be part of this conversation, that we should stop trying to equate what you're talking about doing with this notion, which has been around for so long, that Canada could do more to get LNG to Tidewater and make that a bigger part of the solution overseas in the immediate term, or what?
There were actually a lot of conversations this week at the G7, at the G20, at the IMF World Bank meetings about LNG. And I think we're all aware of the need that the Europeans have for LNG. What I think maybe Canadians are less attuned to is the extent to which our Asian partners are also very focused on needing LNG. And one of the things I heard from both rich industrialized countries and countries in the developing world this week is how important access to LNG is for them, and how if they can't get it, they're going to have to burn thermal coal. And these were private meetings, so I'm not going to name the person, but there were more than a couple of ministers from global South countries who said, I believe in climate action. I want to burn less coal. One minister said quite movingly, I made a promise to my parliament we would stop burning thermal coal, and I'm not going to be able to keep that promise because I don't have enough LNG, and LNG is too expensive right now. So, I think that LNG, as the European Union has recognized, is an important transition fuel. And Canada is fortunate to have a lot of natural gas. We have some big LNG projects coming online soon on the West Coast. That is important, and that will be an important contributor to the green transition in the world and to providing energy security for our partners. And as the Prime Minister said over the summer, we will always be looking at economically viable LNG projects.
Deputy Prime Minister. Reggie Cicchini, Global News. Wanted to touch on so-called friendshoring. I know the U.S. Treasury Secretary has talked about it. You've touched on it in the past. How and why do you think it's an important tool, or maybe do you even see it as a practical tool? And if so, what can it do to strengthen relations between Canada and the U.S.?
I think it is an important tool, and I think it absolutely can and will and is already strengthening relations between Canada and the U.S. The meetings this week underscored for me yet again how significant the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been in shifting the thinking of the world's leading democracies when it comes to how we build our economies. And it's very, very sobering to be in rooms like this with the Europeans. Profoundly, they are being affected by their dependence on Russian natural gas. There was a very strong speech about that given this week by the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Joseph Borrell. So that has been a real wake-up call for all of the world's democracies. And I think the lesson we are all taking from that experience is we need to build resilience into our supply chains. We need to build resilience into the fundamental building blocks of our economies. And, autarky is not an answer. Autarky will make everyone poorer. We are going to need to continue to be economically dependent on one another. It's a lot better to be economically dependent on a democratic ally than on anyone else. And, as I said on Tuesday, I thought it was important to recognize that the Europeans really stepped up during COVID. They stepped up and continued to supply us with vaccines. That was politically tough. It was the right thing to do. It's important to recognize that and to let them know that that really builds trust. You asked specifically about the United States. And I have had many conversations in the past and had a lot of conversations also this week with Secretary Yellen about friendshoring and how we see that further building our economic relationship between our two countries. I think you're already seeing the practical and positive results for Canada of friendshoring in some of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of reporters here in Washington wrote quite appropriately of the danger posed to Canada by some of the initial proposals on how the EV incentives would be written. That didn't happen. And instead, the EV incentives were written in such a way that actually privileges the economic relationship with Canada, precisely because the U.S. has taken what I believe to be the profoundly wise economic and political decision that they would rather be dependent on us for their critical minerals and metals than be dependent on anybody else. Now, that is great for Canada's relationship with the U.S., but from my perspective, most importantly, this is a once-in-a-generation economic opportunity for Canadian workers.
If I can follow as well with a question on Ukraine, does Canada intend to step in to try and fill a gap when it comes to the Starlink crisis? Obviously, Elon Musk has said that financing is burning out, and he's gone to the Pentagon to ask for funding. Does Canada intend to step in there?
It's a good question. I've had some conversations about that this week. And I think I'll limit myself to saying we are glad to be one of the leading countries when it comes to supporting Ukraine. I spent a lot of time here in Washington this week with Ukraine's finance minister, Siddhi Marchenko. We hosted him twice here at the embassy. And we're going to continue talking with the Ukrainians. Our principle is to listen to them and to ask them what they need.
Randy from Bloomberg News. What specific measures the government is looking at to level the playing field on investment incentive for carbon capture projects and other clean energy projects? Are you bringing incentives in line with the U.S.?
That is a great question. It is something we are very, very focused on. I'm going to start by pointing out that Canada has been and continues to be a leader when it comes to climate action and when it comes to putting in place very powerful incentives for the green transition in Canada. Our price on pollution is recognized internationally as a very economically efficient and powerful tool when it comes to climate action. And, really since we formed government, we have year after year been ambitiously investing in continued climate action. And you saw the Prime Minister this week announcing some further investments in greening our steel industry, for example. So we are there, we're at the table, we are working very hard on it, and not just working hard on it, but delivering results. And when it comes to CCUS, that is something which we have already clearly put forward. It's something which we're going to do, and we're working very hard with the industry, with the provinces, especially the province of Alberta, to get the first big CCUS investment in Canada. Okay, having said that, the Inflation Reduction Act is a very important piece of legislation in the U.S. Canada fully supports that direction, and my view is Canada must continue to be the very best place in the world to invest in the green transition. I think there is nothing wrong with, indeed a lot very good about, a healthy competition among the world's economies to say, you know what, I want to do the green transition best and fastest. I want to get the most investment coming into my economy so we can accomplish this very important change and get the great Canadian jobs that that change will bring. And Canada is definitely up for that.
And another question, if I may, related to the G20 meeting. You alluded to that a little bit earlier. We've been hearing that there's been a lot of disagreements and tensions among G20 members. Would you be able to tell us exactly what happened in the meeting and why there's no post-G20 statement yet?
You know what, I think I'm going to stick to speaking for Canada. And I have been very clear about the strong position that Canada took. Maybe the only thing I'll add is, I'm going to add two things actually. Something very important was that Serhiy Marchenko was present at the meeting. He spoke very effectively about what is happening in Ukraine. And, you know, he said, I'm here. And after, you know, it's hard right now to travel from Ukraine. And he said, it's after I left Kyiv that those missile strikes happened. And my family, my wife and my kids are there. And he talked about how frightening that was. I don't think he used the word frightening, but we got the message. Those were strikes in the center of Kyiv. I think it was very powerful and very important for us to hear directly from him what is happening. And I could certainly see on the faces of my counterparts in their subsequent comments how affected we all were by hearing that direct human testimony. The second thing I will say is, you know, that of course Serhiy made the moral and the ethical and the legal case for why Russia needs to get out of Ukraine right now. And I did too. And so did all of our allies. But we also made the economic case, which is that, you know, this is, I'm not going to pretend that this is a straightforward time in the global economy. This is a really, really challenging time. And that was something that ministers and governors of central banks, we discussed candidly amongst ourselves. There is one thing, though, that's actually really simple. There's one simple thing that could happen that would make the global economy much more secure. And that is for Russia to get out of Ukraine. That would have an impact on food security. It would have an impact on energy prices. It would take a lot of the turbulence out of the global economy. It could happen. That would be really significant. So we all have a real and clear economic interest. And that was an argument that I and others tried to put forward.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, okay, and truly, thank you very much. It's very nice to see you guys and talk to you.
Can you tell us if there's any other countries in the G20 that are kind of on board with us? And wanting
Thank
to
you
take part
very
in that?
much.